Thank you for joining today. And thanks to our audience. We're going to give it a little bit of time for people to trickle in, maybe 30 seconds or so. Would love to know where everybody's coming in from. I'm coming in from Boulder, Colorado. Chance, how about you?
Sacramento, California. It's nice and gray here. The triple polar vortex that's coming through the second time has made us the Seattle-esque, as it were. It's gray, drizzling, which should give you a little more snow from where you're at, especially for this time of year.
We will take it. We got a good dump last week and not much more than that. So we'll take all the snow we can get. Hopefully there are some folks who are enjoying maybe beautiful Southern California weather, maybe something a little tropical, but thanks to everybody who's joined. We've got a great topic today about moving from kind of the concept of piloting to how you prove value. Of course, before we jump in, for those of you guys who are subscribed, we'll be sending out a recording of this webinar and an email with the slides. So for today, just stay tuned, ask questions in the chat, and we'll make sure you get all the content after the fact. I first, before we jump into the content, love to introduce Chance. I get the chance to work with him often. PTP is a great partner of ASAP's, and Chance in particular is a very talented person who is a forward-thinking CX leader with over 25 years of experience in both design and implementation. One of the things that he specialized in is the advancement of interaction automation and the generation of AI-powered customer engagement tools. His cross-vertical work has transformed how organizations pilot, test, and scale AI responsibly. And as I mentioned, PTP is a great partner of ASAP's. They're a CX consulting and implementation firm that helps forward-thinking brands design, select, and implement AI solutions that elevate every customer interaction and drive bottom-line results. So Chance, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Mackenzie. And let me do a little intro for you too, because I thoroughly enjoy working with you. And I understand is you are the head of customer growth at ASAP. You lead a team of customer engineers, success managers, and insight to build impactful generative agents to the world's biggest brands. That's a lot of information there. So you do a lot of great things with generative agents, which is fantastic. I think the biggest thing, though, is that you're helping companies modernize the way that they interact with their service and their own customers. So we're driving a new experience through some of the innovation that you're building. ASAP itself, it builds AI native solutions that solve the hardest problems in customer service. You guys help lead enterprise to scale and reduce costs and turn contact centers into true value drivers. So ASAP recently launched its new customer experience platform, which I am personally excited about, ASAP CXP, and it redefines AI's role in the contact center and empowers organizations to deliver the agentic enterprise of tomorrow. How about a little bit about the CXP?
It's a big mission, but something we're really excited about. And, I think it's a good segue into today's conversation. Some of the folks on the line today might have been with us in a webinar that we did in November with another PTP colleague, Crystal Collier. She and I spent a good amount of time talking about feeling safe enough to scale and how to de-risk generative AI for the enterprise. And that conversation really focused on ideas of how to get started planning for a pilot. A couple of the most important takeaways from that conversation were, yes, according to the research that was released in 2025, most Gen AI pilots that were studied fail. That's that infamous MIT and Mackenzie study. But if you dig a little bit deeper into the data, the good news is that planning can really set you up for success. And part of thoughtful planning, which Crystal really hammered on, is this notion of understanding your organization's innovation tolerance as a way of adapting piloting and testing capabilities to be most successful in your organization. We also talked a little bit about use case selection and how to go about that process, and really landed on one important conclusion, which is it's fine to start small, but you need to start now, because the value that comes from these sorts of capabilities are compounding. And with technology changing as quickly as you can, starting 3 months from now means a material loss in potential impact. So absolutely. With that kind of go ahead, please, Chance.
No, absolutely. I was just saying absolutely. Like you and Crystal hit on all of the good points for pilots.
Yeah. And I think with that in mind, we can sort of move from the kind of concept of how you might think about planning a pilot to how you get started and what you do once you're actively working on that pilot configuration. And so today's agenda will focus on best practices, measuring what matters, creating a culture of continuous testing and learning, and then we'll wrap up with a couple of key takeaways. And when I really think about this subject, Chance, we spend a lot of time, you and I and our organizations, thinking about how to get started. And oftentimes that can really focus on those topics that Crystal and I spoke about, which is what's the right intent? How do I get started quickly? Like, what are the logistics behind it? And I think one theme that you've really educated me on that we'll be talking about today is this idea that that's all part of the process. But if you aren't thoughtful and aligned on how you're going to test these types of technologies and then measure their efficacy, it's a lot of pre-work for not a lot of value. And you and I both see this with our customers, that the decisions of how and what to test these kind of new capabilities can feel a little bit gnarly and complicated because they're colored by our traditional enterprise testing and release habits. So the stuff that made us feel confident for years and years, I'm going to write this test, it's going to faithfully adhere to this test, I'm going to consider it passed, doesn't really apply when you're talking about generative or agentic capabilities. And so there's this mindset shift that really needs to happen. Chance, what's your take on why this is important?
Yeah, no, you're exactly correct. So we've in the past have created what I like to term as very deterministic technology. We told it what to do, how to output the same way every time an action comes through. And with generative, it's probability and output. And so that has variations in it. And to apply our more rigid deterministic testing against an agentic or a generative agent creates problems in the testing cycle. One, it stymies the cycle itself. And then two, it puts people in kind of this perilous, we're never going to get out of testing, or, testing is too long in order to get to a pilot, right? And so it's understanding these nuances and preparing for them up front, like with your use cases, understanding that the way that you're going to test, especially in user acceptance testing, is going to be very different. There are really not a lot of differences in your QA test and your shake test when you're testing data adherence and when you're looking at connections and things like that. But when you get to UAT, there is a vast difference in how you test.
Absolutely. And how would you start to think about best practices for an audience like this that maybe has some exposure into these type of capabilities or might be doing it for the first time?
So there's a couple of things that I'll talk about. So one, when you start test planning has to start as part of design. So as you know, in your previous conversation, you and Crystal talked about use case development and they align to business outcomes and so on. That's really where testing needs to be as well, as far as those that are going to UAT and design those testings, those test scenarios, as it were. And then there's a slightly different methodology that you use, or framework or evaluation, we'll call it, as you're evaluating a UAT. But when we look at some of the standards that we have for iteration, always good requirements, they're AI requirements, they're a little bit different, but you need to have them. And as I mentioned, you need to have adequate connectivity, which is really part of the testing that happens in normal cycles. The other big thing is going to be simulation. The ability to simulate scenarios against the intents are huge. And this is where I'm going to introduce the notion of training. Before you get to a launch of something, either in pilot or production, you're training your agent, your AI, your agentic, your generative, however you want to term it, in simulation and with what you're doing during the testing cycles, right? And so the ability to do at scale volume simulations is going to be huge for the testing cycle itself. Outside of that, we want to look at a testing cycle for UAT. Really, you're doing tests, every 24 to 48 hours, and you're not spending more than 5 days at a time on this. So there shouldn't be a perilous journey of UAT, because the process of evaluation, which we'll talk about, will help you move things backwards and forwards throughout the group. Again, you don't take away your functional testing, right? So you want to make sure that it still has the right connectivity and those elements are there. But you do want to make sure that the agent knows its facts and can provide a contextually relevant conversation. So when we do UAT, outside of understanding what the boundaries are for the GA, and that it's providing factual information and it stays contextually relevant in the conversation, there are definitely different attributes that we also consider when we're evaluating them.
Could you talk a little bit about that point you were making, test, tune, retest every 24 to 48 hours and like not for a period of longer than 5 days, and why you've kind of come to that as a best practice?
Yeah. And so when we get into the evaluation criteria, when we do a group of tests, you have to think of this as you're not going to have thousands of test cases, right? Because you're going to have done a lot of simulation. So it's going to reduce the number of scenarios that you actually need to go through. The 24 to 48 hours is what we call a retest, obviously. And if we find something that doesn't match the ideal scenario, then you want the engineers to go back through and evaluate where potentially they need to make a change and then immediately retest. And you don't need to take everything in scale and do it all in retest. These can be compartmentalized retesting, because with the generative agent, it's generally a conversation point, or it's an inflectuation point or a quality of conversation element that they're embellishing with. And so you don't have to take an entire new set and go back. You also don't need to regression either completely. There are some level of regression, so I don't want to take that off the table, but not for every scenario that you're retesting do you have to do full regression on. So that's where the 24 to 48 hours in. I found the error today. I gave it to the team. The team corrected it. I can test it the same day again, or I can test it the next day. The 5-day cycle is really the run of test itself. And so depending on whether I'm doing simulation testing or what I like to call a interaction test, right? So if you're in chat or in voice, it's direct interaction. That shouldn't last for more than 5 days. And you should follow that cycle of basically, here's something that needs to be enhanced for training, and then, go back and retest that again. And so those are the value in doing that, is that that 5-day cycle gets you through the UAT where you need to be. Now, in my experience, without looking at what a hardened timeline would have, or having the pre-set up elements, or even the new evaluation criteria, I've seen people spiral for months in UAT testing. And that's really, it's unnecessary, because they, again, using the rigid system is creating the falsehood that they need to go through everything repeatedly on and ongoing. So, I mean, the reality is when you're testing an agent, it is just like you're testing a live new hire agent. So the same type of energy that you put in coaching and training, which is why they call this period training, with a new hire is the same thing that you do with an agentic. And then how you're evaluating very much aligns how you would evaluate a new hire as they are going out on the floor.
Yeah. And I think you're bringing up a really important point, which is the structure in which you test needs to be really closely aligned to the way the technology itself actually operates, and designed to get you speed and outputs, but also help the technology shine. So being clear on what you can expect from these kinds of systems, like you pointed out, they're going to behave variably. They're going to behave in somewhat non-deterministic scenario or non-deterministic ways. It's super important to the way that you actually design the testing. And like you were saying, there's a really strong analogy between how an AI agent ought to perform and how you would expect a new human agent to perform. So can you talk a little bit about that kind of principle, how you think about human training and AI agent training?
Yeah, so the simplest terms are, other than there's some mechanical differences between the two, a live agent and an AI agent, they need the same knowledge, right? So whether it's a knowledge library induction or it's policy and procedures that need to be brought in, they need access to the same data, and they need the same level of instruction and oversight. And so those are really the most simplistic terms of how you should look at a generative agent or agentic in its relation to a live agent. They're pretty much the same things, right? Our expected output is that our agents, and I'm going to use them plurally together, they need to be consistent in what they're delivering. They need to be with a level of accuracy. They need to be compliant with whatever regulations and or policy procedure that we have. And the way that they improve, again, agents together, is through coaching and tuning. And so, we do side-by-sides with live agents. You can simulate with an agentic agent, and you can provide feedback that allows it to be tuned or for the agent, live agent, to improve how they're having conversations. So those are the parallels that draw between, which is what makes user acceptance testing for these agents very, very different.
Yeah, and even beyond that, like you've brought up the point to me before that when you think about the new hire training process, you kind of have a natural understanding of what they must, et cetera, do. Can you talk a little bit about how that evaluation criteria gets crafted and then used as part of the testing process?
Yeah. So in alignment with requirements, I tend to pull the same information that you would give to your new hire class. And so, whether knowledge articles, training material, whatever CRM access they may need to have, or green screen, depending on your environment, to the data that they need to have, those are the same elements. And again, the difference is I might be connecting a generative agent through an API connection versus the agent going through an actual screen and looking at it, but they need the same data. So as we put those elements together, we've also formed rules around what the agent should and shouldn't do. And so this kind of gets into the framework that we use when we're evaluating and testing. And it's actually very similar to what we're doing with our agents. So there are things that we ask our agents to never do, right? Live agents or agentic agents. We don't want them to give inaccurate information. We also don't want them to confuse topics. We don't, we can talk about multiple things in a conversation, but we also don't want to create a confusing set of elements for the customer in that interaction. We want to stay, in compliance and regulatory. We also want to make sure that we're not doing anything illegal. Maybe it's company information we don't want. Those are things that we never want any of our agents to do. There are things we ask our agents to do or they must do, right? So they must adhere to a process. They must provide factual information. They need to ensure their compliance. They may be asked to reinforce brand. And in some cases, they may be able to understand and provide information sequentially within the conversation. So those are things that we ask them that it must do during a conversation. Then there are elements that we have what we call should do, or what we would like them to do during a conversation, which requires tuning. And over time, we'll get through tuning and coaching to bring those elements in. And so when we talk about like a should element, these are, in fact, the elements that don't prohibit you from moving to production with an agent or prevent a new hire from moving to the floor, but they're things that we would like them to do. And so let me give you a couple examples of them. So in the should do scenario, we always want them to have the ability to have a pleasant conversation, to show empathy at different points, being able to understand that dead air in voice channel is not something that we want. So things like checking back with the customer if we're accessing information or if we're on hold. Those are things that we should do. And over time in practice and through tuning, those are things that will end up happening. And you can see that with your live agent population. And it's very, very much the same for your generative and your agentic agents as well.
I think in that last stage, there's also an element of time. And I think you sort of started to get at this, is like this idea of never, ever should you do certain things. You must do certain things. And over time, you should be doing others. And it's a very different mindset than the deterministic testing. As you've been pointing out, it's much more akin to how you would be thinking about training a traditional workforce. And it's important in particular, I think, with technologies like generative AI, because you can avoid, or you need to avoid, over tuning on the should do's to the set of models that are underpinning the current configuration. At ASAPP, I know one of the big kind of values that we bring to our customers is the orchestration of a number of different models for different tasks at any point in time.
Yep.
But we never want to lose perspective on the customer experience that we are trying to deliver, which means kind of walking that fine line between how are the models we have access to today operating, and how do we configure them in such a way that they can change and transform over time as the ecosystem that we're working with and does, without degrading that customer experience. And there's some novel capabilities in our product. You talked a little bit about simulation and things along those lines that allow us to feel a little bit more comfortable with those capabilities before changes actually go into production. But I think a lot of it does come back to these concepts you're describing of you need to have a really clear articulated point of view of what the generative system should never, ever do, must do, and should do to avoid kind of falling into a trap of persistent and like never ending testing cycles.
Yeah, exactly. And as we look at kind of the flow, as it were, the criteria which we're providing us, when you're in the testing cycle, we talk about things that fall in the never and the must categories. And I don't want people to be confused with those as must being good and never being bad. We're really using those as check marks within the flow itself to get through what really needs to be taken care of before you go to production versus the should. And so let me give you an example of variability in conversation, which generally happens. And so this falls in the should do category. But we want contextually relevant, we want factual, and maybe some of my must do's are, I need to be able to brand, right? And so if I ask a generative agent the same question, each time I'm going to get a slightly varied answer. And so if I ask the agent, what is my checking account balance? And it would say that, oh, your X bank, your checking account balance is $100. And then I ask it again, what is my checking account balance? And it might say, your premier checking account at X bank, the balance is currently $100, right? So those are two variations where everything is contextually relevant, it's factual. We got some branding in there. The first time we probably didn't get enough branding in there, which we can tune on, but it's nothing that holds up the agent. It's the same. If you think about a new hire agent where you've asked them to do branding at every turn that they have, they're going to miss a few as they do it, but it doesn't hurt the conversation and it doesn't impact the experience. And so when we look at evaluating in UAT, that's what we're looking for. So in that example, both of those scenarios would actually be a should do and would be passed. And so in production, we would continually coach the agent through tuning and allow the ability to build that experience and that knowledge so that in future conversations, it'll start bringing in those elements that we would like it to do. Now, if I did something in that conversation where I said your social security number is XYZ and your balance is X, then that's a must never do. And that would then go back into what we call a resolve and retest, where those that are working with the agent and helping position it could then embellish how they need to set up the guardrails around that. Same thing with the balance. If the balance had been $101 and its true balance was $100, that would be something that falls in the never do scenario, and we end up getting resolve and retested. And then using the timeline, it would be either same day resolution and retest, or next day resolution and retest in order to get through the UAT cycle to ensure that the most viable product is being moved into production, which is an agentic or generative agent that is a should do scenario.
Yeah. And I think that sort of concept of what's good enough, what will improve over time, is a really important balance to keep in mind when you're also trying to think about moving fast with new technology capabilities. There's a sort of game here for enterprises to play of, I have a big vision for how I want this technology to play in my contact center and in my customer experience. I also want to preserve the trust and the credibility that I've built with my customers over the years. How do I balance these two kind of dimensions? And I think really orienting your mindset as an enterprise around these AI agents are much more akin to a human workforce than they are to a deterministic flow in an IVR is a great way of thinking about how you can bring these sorts of systems online. And Chance, you, I think, have some really strong terminology that's worth the audience also thinking about. We've been talking about tuning. Incrementing is a different beast. Will you share your thoughts with the group on that?
Yeah, so just to kind of recap. So training is what happens when you're establishing the agent and going through testing. And then tuning is bettering the agent while it's in production, so that likening to monitoring an agent, a live agent. Incrementing is adding new stuff. And so it's pretty simplistic in its definition. But if you're going to add a new intent, or let's just say, as an example, from our healthcare groups, we might be doing something around providing, information about current policies, and then they want to add in the ability for the agent to recommend a provider in the area. That would be an increment. So it's not core to what was originally released. And so it requires development, obviously, and then going through its own UAT cycle for that specific component, and then be joined with the rest of the information in the agent. So if you're training, it's prior to UAT. If you're tuning, it's in production. And if you're incrementing, you're restarting the training and the tuning on that new element before it goes to production.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to switch gears a little bit to keep us moving through our agenda. We've talked about the testing framework. Measurement is the other side of this coin. And I'm a really big proponent of avoiding getting stuck in that sort of middle messy part of testing, where if you're not clear on what you want out of a use case or out of a pilot, you're not going to find anything that's worth the time that you've invested. Some of our customers can get really sophisticated when they're thinking about this. When they're talking about their original pilots, they're thinking about, okay, a year from now, where do I want the OpEx expenditure to be, and where do I want the CapEx expenditure? And others are very simplistic about it, thinking like, this is something novel and interesting, and I want to just kind of get a feel for it. I really think that without some measures that are objective and grounded in the technology itself, you end up without a lot of answers to the sorts of questions that these enterprises are asking, and it sort of becomes an opinion party. How do you think about aligning test metrics to business outcomes and not necessarily just software benchmarks?
So that's very good question, because my belief and my experience through the clients is that if you don't have a business outcome aligned to your pilot, then there is going to be that variation in decisioning, which is either going to stymie your entire pilot, or it's going to rush a pilot to production. And I'll give you a couple of examples from a metrics perspective. Like if your only metric is high containment within your channel, because that is driven by one source, or maybe it's a technical component of containment, but you have poor quality, you've damaged your experience, right, within that interaction. And so you may lose customers. You might be looking at things like, oh, how do I prevent repeat callers by providing them with more robust information? But those repeat callers may be people who just have additional questions on different topics, but traditionally you would have counted them as a repeat caller. So as we look at the metrics, when you put together your pilot business outcomes, when you put together your user acceptance testing, they should be aligned to business outcomes as well. And those business outcomes should be aligned with all of the parties that are involved. Otherwise, Mackenzie, as you described, there are going to be two different parties basically pulling at the same thing. And it's either going to be novel and we don't like it because we didn't know what to measure, or we got what we wanted out of it, but the experience was too poor. So there's got to be a blend between the two, which is why business outcomes are so important, which also means that this is business-led initiative. It's not necessarily a technical initiative. A generative agent or an agentic agent is not just another piece of technology.
And so when we look at like what's described on the screen, that sort of idea of operational metrics and experience metrics, would you encourage our audience to think of these as independent? You pick and choose? How should we use a framework like this?
So these are more, for me, these are suggestions, right? Again, your business outcomes are going to dictate what those metrics are. Is this commonly what people are looking at today when they look at voice or they're looking at chat and bringing in the generative agent or an agent into those channels? They do look at these elements, but the other pieces that they also bring in is understanding the experience itself, right? So you need to really partner these together. Are there other metrics that you can bring into? Absolutely. If you have core metrics that you're looking at today, you can also bring those in for evaluation itself. But the big key is to be able to blend your qualitative and your quantitative metrics together to ensure that you are getting what you need and your customers are also getting what they need. And a lot of times they say, we often design our metrics around the experience we intend to give our customer, but the experience our customer is expecting is often very different. And so again, business outcomes generally align with the customer's expectation of experience, which is why they're key to leveraging them with the testing as well with the outward measurement.
Yeah.
I'll also point out too that when you talk about the C-levels, they are more looking for the blend. They're looking for increase in channel containment. They're looking for the quality of those interactions. They're also looking for either a scale or net improvement in customer experience. They want to know if the improvements have a positive deflection, right? Do they keep them within the self-service channels? Are they reducing, different elements around repeat callers, or, what I like to call an everyday caller in financials, the person who calls in every day to check their balance kind of scenario. Like, have those folks, are they being serviced? Can I get stronger compliance and process adherence? So those that have like disclosures that need to be given at different points, like am I improving the delivery of those disclosures? So those are other types of things that you can include as part of your measurement. But again, this is where you design up front, you have to be aligning to business outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also to your point of, there's what the C-suite looks like, there's what the folks who are designing the system looks like, and then there's the customer perspective. Knowing what's important to your organization if you're working in these enterprises, and knowing who you're speaking to and the story you're trying to tell, I think is an important part of the metrics selection as well. There are organizations that I think we've seen where you get very fixated on the current project in hand, and others who are thinking about, this is one project in a long series of opportunities for us to transform. Can you share an example with the group of an organization that you think might be getting this right, this sort of balance of metrics, ROI, and audience?
So we have a couple that initially started off a little bit rocky, and have been able to move the mindset of, those that are watching over the pilot itself. And some of them are actually moving into production, but what they've done is they've realized they've entered kind of the way that you start. This is a novel idea. Let's go in and see what it can do. We really don't have our expectations set. Maybe tech brought it in and the business got kind of drug along with it. And then through the pilot, we've repositioned to say, now that we're here and you've seen it, let's talk about to the business. What is it that you now expect now that you understand the technology, and what are those outcomes? And being able to, again, realign against those, and then also move through what really matters in the measurement components. And so that shift with those particular clients has been extremely beneficial. And the key to that was around change management, right? It's one of the things I think people often miss, is that it's not just wanting to do it. You also have to be prepared to handle an agentic or a generative AI. Like with testing, there are a number of things, policies, procedures that we have within our organizations that need to also be changed, right? But more directly to your point, with having the realignments and people moving through the business outcomes, and then adopting the new elements of UAT, and then realigning on the cross between quant and qual in their measurements, they're getting a higher rate of participation internally, and the experience for their customers has actually improved. And one of the companies we're talking about is a travel and leisure company. The other one is actually a healthcare company. And so both of them, through realignment, now understand the missteps from before, and are at this point taking their pilots from pilots themselves and moving them into production. And the beautiful part is that when you design a pilot should be designed for production. And so if you're designing a pilot to throw away for later, you also want to look at how you're putting that together. Everything should be designed to move immediately to production, or at least pause and then move to production.
Yeah. And it occurs to me as you're describing that also, that as much as we talk about new human agents needing to get trained and to understand policies and procedures, and generative AI agents need to get trained on these new policies and procedures, these enterprises need to get trained on these new capabilities. And part of the value of piloting is, as you're describing, organizations starting to go from people like you and me kind of talking in concept to living through what it's actually like. Because it does take hands-on experience to go from 20 years testing and measuring in one way to hopefully a future that is much more nimble, conversational, and value oriented. But that's a big experiential change for organizations as well.
Yeah, and I think just a kind of a side note on that one too is that oftentimes, especially with new technology, when there's a change, we bring our agents in for retraining on certain items, or we do newsletters, or we do, on our tailgates, we talk about maybe a policy change or a procedural change, and we do that in mass. With a generative agent, you're only training one agent that's handling many conversations. So the ability to get that information out faster and more succinct lies within the agent itself. And if you're applying we'll call it the new method or framework of evaluating a generative agent, your time to get that information out and up and running is far shorter than it has been in the past. And I'll give an example again for healthcare clients. There's a change in their policies, right, for their different plans that they have. Annually, there's a change. It takes them, in some cases, a month or two to get all of their agents trained on that. In reality, for the generative agent that we're using with them, it's only taken us about 3 weeks to go through the process of getting everything in and then doing our 5 days of UAT. And that agent is ready to have those conversations.
At scale. Yeah. And you just gave me a thought for maybe we need a part 3 of this series, which is how human agents' experiences shift in their work with the sort of adoption of these new generative capabilities. That's a fascinating subject in and of itself, but we are about at time. So first of all, Chance, thank you. I've had a lot of fun talking with you about this, but I would love if you would kind of think back to our conversation. If there's one thing that you'd love for people to take away from today's discussion, what would you leave our audience with?
I think the notion that a generative agent or agentic agent should be treated in the same manner as live agents. That I think is probably the key thing that when people look at it, they haven't fully grasped, but it is the same care and feeding for both.
Absolutely. And I think the same, you've educated us on structuring the inputs in a way, the same way you would think about education and learning as a human for yourself or for your organization. You should be thinking about it for these capabilities. Thank you, Chance, again for the time. And one quick plug for our audience. If this was interesting to you, in addition to my off-the-cuff idea that maybe we'll do a third session, we do have another webinar coming up in mid-January. This is about our CXP platform and the path to the agentic enterprise. Our head of product, Devidas, will be talking about what the platform entails and the value that it provides. So we would love to include any of you guys in that audience. Alongside Devidas will be Chris Arnold, our VP of Contact Center Strategy, and Justin Mulhern, our Director of Solutions Engineering. It'll be a fun session. Otherwise, thank you everybody for the time today. Hope you have happy holidays, and we'll be talking to you soon.
Thanks, Mackenzie.
Thank you.